Well, in Live on Live today, we focus on China, a country that's been massively working to expand its economic, political and strategic influence, not least through a $900 billion scheme to revive the ancient Silk Road trade route. China's leader, Xi Jinping, has become the country's most powerful ruler since Chairman Mao. The country is heavily investing in the developing world, in Africa in particular, and it's also positioning itself as a leader in the fight against climate change. Well, with us to discuss all of this is today's guest, Elodie Goulesque, who's heading to London now after spending 3 years as RFI's correspondent in Beijing. Thanks for being with us, Elodie.
Thank you.
So it must have been a very interesting time to be a correspondent in China with the rise of Donald Trump, not to mention North Korean nuclear and ballistic missile tests.
Yes, indeed. So it's a very interesting time in China for Chinese people because, as you said, the country is developing a lot and really, really quickly. So that's very interesting to see how Chinese people are, living this. And then, yes, Donald Trump, North Korea are not very light topics. So
you've been kept busy.
Yes, especially because of Kim Jong-un, who ruined most of my weekends in Beijing.
Oh, goodness.
But yes, it's been a very intense time recently in China.
Right, so I want to just turn your focus, first of all, to Emmanuel Macron's visit to China, which he wrapped up today after 3 days. The trip was seen as a chance to forge stronger ties between China and Europe. Tell us, how is France, and in particular, how is Macron viewed by China with Brexit and with political uncertainty in Germany right now? Is Macron sort of seen as the voice of Europe?
So he is, for most Chinese people who are not necessarily into politics, they know Macron because he's married to an older woman, which is the main topic for them. And then, yes, it's true. So Chinese people, the government is really, really scared about Brexit. So that's been in the news a lot recently. Indeed, I think, yes, Emmanuel Macron could be the new, strong leader of Europe. And he came to China for 3 days, which is quite a long trip. And he said he would come back every year. So I think he is definitely trying to have strong ties with China.
They really rolled out the red carpet for him. Tell us, is it quite controversial then, the fact that Macron is married to a much older woman? How's that seen in China?
It is indeed, because in China, marriage is very important. You have to get married very young, so then you can take care of your parents. So they think, yes, I think it's 24 years. It's way too much. Yes, definitely.
Now, in his New Year message, Emmanuel Macron sort of said he called for a united Europe that needed to remain strong in the face of China and the United States. He warned other sort of smaller European countries against being too ready to accept Chinese investment money. What sort of partnership do you think Macron is looking for with China?
So I think it's very difficult to know what he has in mind in general, and especially on China, because it hasn't been a big part of his campaign before being president. So we don't really know what his policy is towards China. But he came to Beijing and Xi'an this week, as you said, with many entrepreneurs. So he's definitely coming for business as well. And I understand, I think he also mentioned about the new Silk Road, that countries need to be careful not to be, managed by China, because China has the money. So I think it's a bit tricky to know what he really thinks, because he said this on one side, and then on the other side he comes to China clearly to make business with the country.
And just on the subject of the Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, China says this is going to usher in a golden age of commerce. Beijing is lending something like $8 trillion to 68 countries to build infrastructure for this project. And there's been concern that it might assert more Chinese influence and work in the favour of China rather than other countries involved for the general good of all. Do you think China is working very hard to convince other countries and to convince the world that it has their interests at heart too with this project?
Yes, I think it's a tough job because indeed, as you said, many people don't believe that it's going to be very good for some countries. But China is convinced actually that it's good for both parts, even though if there are doubts, it's because it's already very difficult, for example, for foreign businesses to invest in China, to work in China. And it's a bit a one-way, trade like deal because all those countries, the 68 countries, many of them are poorer countries, developing countries who need money. So it's a bit. I really think China will definitely have a bigger influence on those countries, like it's the case already in Africa.
And how important is this project for China in positioning itself as a world leader and positioning itself in the place that it wants to be in the world?
So it's very, very big. I mean, all the Chinese people know about this big project, the new Silk Road. Everybody's proud of it as well because, it's a new era for China as Xi Jinping qualifies his policy. So it's a big project. It shows that China wants to go forward, wants also to be more open to the world. So it's clearly one of the top priorities of the Chinese government.
It's really pushing globalisation, and Xi's made it clear that he really is an advocate of open markets. But Macron, he really hasn't minced his words when he sort of criticised China for being more closed than Europe was when it came to foreign business. And he also warned that France's trade deficit with China wasn't politically sustainable. He's been very direct in his language. This doesn't seem to have sort of solicited a direct response from China. Instead, Xi Jinping talked about efforts to protect free trade and to improve global governance. I'm just wondering if this speaks to a different sort of cultural approach. Is there a sensitivity in China on tackling issues like this head on?
Yes, there is. And also China has one goal in mind and doesn't really mind about what, other people say. So as long as it can carry on with the path China wants to go to, this is the main thing. And China is a very big and powerful country now. So France, it's important to have good relationships with. But in the end, China, I think, is the real boss right now, I'm afraid.
And just on a domestic level, Xi Jinping, he's emerged as China's most powerful leader since Chairman Mao, after his name and his ideology was enshrined in the constitution. This was back at the Communist Party Congress last October. Can you just take us through and explain for us a little bit what Xi Jinping thought, what that actually means, what Xi's elevation in China itself means, other than presumably his indefinite spell in power?
So again, it's very difficult to analyze this because it's never really clear. In Chinese politics, there's a lot happening in the background, so you don't really know about it. But there is definitely something happening with Xi Jinping. As you said, he's now officially another great leader. And if you travel in China, many people love Xi Jinping. In the countryside, you can find now the portrait of Mao Zedong, and right next to it, the portrait of Xi Jinping. The whole propaganda machine is clearly also as big, I guess, as it was with Mao. But he's a modern man. He's trying to be a bit more westernized, and which is great. I mean, Chinese people, I think, really like him. And he's just, again, doesn't really seem not to care that much about the rules of the Communist Party because he didn't nominate new members at the Standing Committee who could be, the next president and prime minister. So that has been a big thing, and everybody thinks that he might stay in power for many, many years.
And there's not a lot of young blood in the Communist Party, is there?
No. So I think in general there's not much young blood, but that's the key thing. And he's not that old, so he could be the man who wants to stay in power for longer. Actually, being the president of China is not the biggest role he can have. It's more the fact that he's also the leader of the army and the Communist Party. So that doesn't have a 10 years limit. It could be forever.
There's just one more question I want to ask you before we go. We've got about 45 seconds left. I need to ask you about North Korea. Obviously, interesting times with the rhetoric between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, nuclear tests, intercontinental ballistic missile tests. How is all of this being reported from within China, given that China is one of North Korea's few allies?
So there's a lot of critics against the US, putting a lot of pressure on China. But on this point, China is in a tough situation because, as you said, it's one of the last ally of North Korea. Also, it has borders with the country. So I think China is really trying to keep a peaceful situation and trying to help on this. So that's what happens in the media. It's like criticizing the US and then saying, we're just here, because we want peace and we want this issue to be resolved.
Okay, well, thanks very much for taking the time to speak to us, Elodie Goulesque, and good luck in London.